Good afternoon, everyone. And first of all, I'd like to thank the organizers for letting me speak on this very important issue. This is about the value of biodiversity, and especially when we talk about economy, when biodiversity has a very important role to play, which we either tend to overlook or which we do not like quantify because we are always thinking in terms of monetary language, and whatever doesn't quantify into money we tend to overlook. So I'll be speaking on this very important topic. This is about biodiversity and economy. So I'll start my presentation here. So let's talk about the economics of biodiversity. So if we look at the economics of biodiversity, then we can basically quantify it into two parts. The first is called the direct use value, something that can be quantified in monetary terms, in terms of say a part of your GDP. And the other part is the indirect use values, which does not really generate money, but there are goods and services which are very beneficial to all of us, and even for the survival of the human race and this planet. So talking about the direct use values, it is estimated that the global economic value of forest ecosystem goods and services is 4.7 trillion annually. Now that's a huge amount of money. This is about the direct use values of biodiversity, and as you can see, it's very substantial. And if we talk about the indirect use values, then the most comprehensive global estimates, they value the ecosystem services that is provided by the biodiversity at US dollar 125 to 140 trillion US dollars, which is about 1.5 times the size of the global GDP. I emphasize that the indirect use values is 1.5 times the global GDP. So that's a huge amount of money, huge amount of indirect use values that the biodiversity is generating. So now let's look at the issues here. The first issue is that the biodiversity loss is among the top global risks to the society. When we talk about the climate change, or when we talk about the different environmental impacts that is happening all across the globe, then this is one very important impact or change that is happening, is that the biodiversity is slowly and slowly disappearing, and it's a global risk. So it's one of the top global risk to the society for our survival, for the survival of the mankind. Now, there are many studies on this, and one study that has been done, they estimate that the natural forests have declined by 6.5 million hectares per year. Now, 6.5 million hectares per year globally between 2010 and 2015. So if you look at this particular area, the size, the extent of the biodiversity loss or the loss of the natural forest, then it is equivalent to an area larger than the United Kingdom. So every year we are losing a substantial amount of forest all across the globe. Now you would have come across some news items or some articles which talk about wetlands. Now the wetlands are basically the water bodies, and especially if we talk about the inland wetlands, then they are very important for bird conservation point of view, and they also generate a lot of other income, for example, fishing. So the natural wetlands declined by 35% between 1970 and 2015. So this is a 35-year time frame we are talking about, and the natural wetlands, they have declined by 35%. So can you imagine the amount of loss that we are having? We have lost our water bodies, wetlands, by 35%. And all of you would know the importance of the corals, the coral reefs. They are very highly productive systems, and especially if you look at the fishing industry, then it is a very important ecosystem. And the corals, they're also like a living body. I think, as you all know, that they are living animals virtually, and they regenerate every year, and more get added on to it. And some coral islands have also been formed over the years. So the 30% of the corals or the coral reefs that we have, they are now at the risk of, of their survival is at risk from bleaching. When the conditions are adverse or when there is a lot of environmental impact, then the corals tend to die off, they start dying, and then they become white or they get bleached. So there's a huge impact on the corals, and eventually on our, it will have a lot of offshoots and a lot of impacts on the way that we live, or on our survival as well. And there has been local extinction of 60% vertebrate population since 1970. So take for instance the cheetah, the Asiatic cheetah that was once found in India, and after the 1960s, it is not found anymore in India, and there is only one surviving population of the Asiatic cheetah that is in Iran. And similarly, we have the Asiatic lion, and there's only one surviving population in the world in a place called Gir in Gujarat. You would all know about it. Yeah. And this is a repetition of what was done earlier. Now let's look at the way forward. What is the way forward is that we need to devise some steps so that like we can save the biodiversity in the longer duration of time. We leave something for our children to, as a legacy. Yeah. So for doing that, the first thing is that some work has also been done, as some of you may be aware, that there's a global biodiversity framework, and it is basically about effective international action to halt and reverse biodiversity loss. In other words, global countries are coming together and addressing this particular issue in whatever way that they can. Now, talking about policy instruments for biodiversity. So let us talk about like when you fill up the petrol in your tank. So you might know that a part of it, a very small part of it goes as an environmental cess or as a pollution cess. So like every time you're filling your tanks, then every liter you are paying some part of it for mitigating the impacts of pollution on the environment. So in that similar manner, we can use our policy instruments for biodiversity, for conserving biodiversity. We can have some kind of biodiversity cess for different activities, especially the ones who are close to the very biodiverse areas, and those who are discharging effluents into biodiverse areas such as rivers or mangroves, things like that. Now, when we talk about biodiversity conservation, then the most major issue that would come before us is about the financing, is from where do we get the funds. So we need to scale up and align finance for biodiversity from all sources. From all sources means from different countries, they have to pool in, because some countries, like say for example, India has got very, huge amount of biodiversity. Or let us talk about the most parts of North America. They have Amazon forest and rainforest, and they're very rich in biodiversity. So even those countries who are not as endowed with the biodiversity resources, even they need to contribute, because this is a global resource and this is not restricted to just one country. And the goods and services that flow out of it, especially the indirect uses, everybody in entire world is benefiting out of it. So there are certain activities that are going there, that are happening. Say for example, say for example, when we talk about mining in forest areas. So if we allow mining in forest areas, then there is biodiversity loss, and therefore there should be a very conscious decision taken, so that like we preserve our biodiversity as well as we do not stop our development. So there are certain subsidies that would be existing. So one needs to actually have a holistic look at it, and those subsidies or the policies that are actually not very beneficial for the biodiversity, they should be reviewed, and a reform should be brought in about them. And then stringent check on development projects in biodiversity areas. So as I said before, in case there is a very rich forest and there is a question of mining or a road passing through, or like some kind of activity that is going to impact the habitat of the wildlife, or it's going to disturb the biodiversity in a way. For example, more open cast mining, say for example, it's very, very deleterious to the environment. So there should be a very stringent check. These activities should not be allowed. We need to identify certain rich biodiversity areas and keep them all together aside for biodiversity conservation. And in fact, in India, as you all know, that we do have the concept of protected areas where we have national parks and sanctuaries which have been like kept aside, and largely they are free of development so far, and they are being kept sacrosanct to the extent possible. Now, the next thing is valuing of biodiverse impacts by business and financial organization. So whenever an organization is coming up and they do the environment impact and assessment, and one part of it should always be like, this should be done as a very elaborate exercise as to what kind of biodiversity is impacted. And I'm reminded that in the UK, there is a lizard-like organism called the newt, N-E-W-T, newt, and it's just like a very small lizard, but people in UK, they are preserving it to an extent that in case you want to build a house and there is a habitat of the newt, then there is a lot of restrictions and they don't allow certain kind of like constructions, and you have to follow a lot of norms. So similarly, when we set up projects, especially the developmental ones near to the mangroves or near to the forests, or near to the protected areas, national park sanctuaries, or near to rich forest areas, then we must make an honest impact of the project on the biodiversity. So I would like to end here by saying that, like, if you think that economy is more important than the environment, then you should really try to count your money by holding your breath. So, and if we just focus on economy and do not take into account our environment, then all we would be left with is, as you can see in this particular slide, is tall buildings, and there would absolutely be nothing, and it's going to impact our lifestyle in a major way. And as you can see yourself, the pollution levels in the cities are rising because of loss of greenery, and all of us are feeling that due to the loss of the forest, we have floods, flash floods at times, and there's a lot of devastation that is being caused due to loss of biodiversity, loss of forest, and the resultant climate change. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you. And there are some very key points, some very key issues that you have raised. It's talking about the natural forest degradation by 6.5 million hectares per annum. That's more than the size of UK. It's really unbelievable sometimes that how much destruction is happening just for the sake of the development. I think if it's a balanced development, it looks good. And one you highlighted that it's a natural wetland degradation by 35% from 1970. It's tremendous. It's too big to handle, I think. Then there are some very good policy measures that you have talked about, keeping the strong checks about on the development project. Of course, talking about the balanced development across the countries. And then biodiversity cells, that is, I think, entirely a new concept that we are talking about. So it's great, and particularly in the light of so many policies, new policies that are emerging in India, and old policies getting diluted. I think there's so many things that need to be looked into. But what is the crux of this whole presentation and for the development is that look at the balanced growth. So to develop the more infrastructure, to develop more industries, don't destroy the lungs on the plant on the earth. I think that is the essence that you gave. So thank you so much, Sujoy. And uh, we learned quite a lot from your deep understanding of interconnected issues on climate, circularity, and biodiversity. Thank you for coming on the platform Sustain, that is a YouTube channel of Institute for Circular Economy and SDGs. We would like to invite you again for more of the audience who would like to learn more from you on this. Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot. It was a pleasure being on this